The mahogany conference room smelled like old money and fresh contempt. I sat in the corner chair they'd relegated me to, watching Margaret Whitmore's family circle the polished table like vultures. They weren't even trying to hide their satisfaction anymore. Margaret had been dead for exactly 72 hours, and her relatives were already mentally redecorating her estate. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman who'd spent 30 years building a fortune from nothing was being mourned by people who'd spent 30 years trying to tear her down. "Before we begin," announced Harold Pemberton, the family attorney, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "I want to acknowledge that this has been a difficult time for all of us." His eyes swept the room, lingering on each face except mine. Margaret's nephew Charles shifted in his Armani suit. Next to him, his wife Victoria dabbed at dry eyes with a handkerchief that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Their daughter Ashley scrolled through her phone with bored entitlement. Then there was Margaret's brother Robert, who'd spent decades convinced that birth order entitled him to everything his younger sister had built. His weathered hands drummed impatiently on the table. These people had tolerated Margaret's success because they assumed it would eventually trickle down to them. They'd played the long game of family politics, showing up to holidays with practiced smiles, all while waiting for their inevitable payday. I had met Margaret exactly 18 months ago. I was working 3 jobs, morning shifts at the diner on Maple Street, afternoons cleaning offices downtown, and evenings tutoring kids whose parents could barely afford $20 an hour. It was a Tuesday morning when this tiny, silver-haired woman walked into the diner and changed everything. She ordered black coffee and wheat toast, then spent 4 hours watching me work. Not in a creepy way. Margaret was too dignified for that. She watched like someone who recognized hunger when she saw it. "You remind me of myself," she'd said as I refilled her cup for the 6th time. 40 years ago, I was slinging hash and saving every penny I could scrape together." That's how Margaret talked, direct, unvarnished. She told me about her first business venture, a small catering company she started with $800 and a beat-up van. How she worked 18-hour days sleeping in the van between jobs, building something from nothing, while her family whispered about her embarrassing career choices. "They all thought I was crazy," Margaret had laughed. "Robert kept telling me to find a nice man and settle down. Charles suggested I get a real job at his father's bank. Even my own mother thought I was throwing my life away on some foolish dream." But Margaret wasn't the settling down type. That catering company became a restaurant, then 2 restaurants, then a hospitality empire that stretched across 3 states. By the time Margaret Whitmore retired, she owned hotels, event venues, and a chain of upscale eateries that bore her name. The family had come crawling back, of course. Success has a way of making people very forgiving of your past eccentricities. Suddenly, Margaret's independence wasn't stubborn anymore, it was inspiring. They started showing up to family gatherings with investment opportunities and business proposals, confident that blood would override the decades of condescension they'd served her. Margaret played along, maintaining the facade of family harmony, while quietly taking notes on everyone's true character. Over the next 18 months, she became the mentor I'd never had and the grandmother I'd lost too young. Margaret taught me about business, about investing, about the difference between being rich and being wealthy. More importantly, she taught me about dignity, how to carry yourself when the world tries to convince you that you don't belong in rooms like this one. The family had tolerated my presence because they assumed I was some kind of charity case, Margaret's good deed that would eventually run its course. They were polite enough when forced to interact with me, but their condescension was palpable. Victoria once asked me if I was getting my education while working for Margaret, as if spending time with one of the most successful businesswomen in the state was somehow less valuable than whatever finishing school had produced her perfectly vapid daughter. But now, Margaret was gone, and the vultures were circling. I could see it in their faces, the barely contained excitement, the practiced grief that would last exactly as long as it took to cash their inheritance checks. They had waited long enough, played nice long enough, and now it was time to collect what they believed was rightfully theirs. Harold cleared his throat and opened the thick folder containing Margaret's final wishes. As many of you know, Mrs. Whitmore was very particular about her affairs. She spent considerable time ensuring that her estate would be handled exactly according to her specifications. The lawyer's tone suggested he was about to deliver exactly what everyone expected, a traditional distribution among family members, with perhaps a small bequest for the loyal employee. The estate consists of several components, Harold continued, methodically laying out documents. The primary residence on Beacon Hill, valued at approximately $4.2 million. The vacation home in Martha's Vineyard, valued at $2.8 million. The investment portfolio, currently worth approximately $15 million. The business interests, which include controlling stakes in 7 restaurants, 2 hotels, and the Whitmore Event Planning Corporation, with a combined estimated value of $28 million. The numbers hung in the air like dollar signs. Robert shifted forward in his chair, his drumming fingers now still with anticipation. Charles loosened his tie slightly, as if the magnitude of his aunt's wealth was making it difficult to breathe. Victoria had abandoned her theatrical grief entirely, her eyes bright with calculation. Even Ashley looked up from her phone, finally understanding that real money was being discussed. "Before we proceed with the specific bequests," Harold said, his voice taking on a more formal tone, "Mrs. Whitmore asked me to read a personal statement she prepared for this occasion." He lifted a single sheet of paper from the folder, and I noticed his hands trembling slightly. Harold had been Margaret's lawyer for over 20 years. He knew exactly what was coming. The silence in the room was thick enough to carve. Harold cleared his throat and began reading Margaret's words. "To my family, who I'm sure are gathered today with great anticipation, I want you to know that I've given considerable thought to how my life's work should be distributed. Over the past several decades, I've had ample opportunity to observe each of you and to understand what truly motivates your interest in my success." The words landed like grenades, and I watched as the family members exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Robert, my dear brother, you've spent 40 years telling anyone who would listen that my business ventures were frivolous pursuits that distracted me from my proper role as a woman. You suggested more than once that I should have married your business partner's son and settled into a nice, quiet life of hosting dinner parties. I find it fascinating that those same frivolous pursuits are now worth approximately $50 million. Robert's face flushed crimson, his hands gripping the table edge so tightly his knuckles went white. "Charles, my nephew, you've always been quick to offer unsolicited advice about how I should manage my affairs. You were particularly vocal about my decision to mentor young people from backgrounds different from our own, suggesting that I was being taken advantage of by people who couldn't possibly appreciate what I was offering them. You seem to believe that gratitude and respect could only come from those who shared our social standing." Charles shifted uncomfortably, his Armani suit suddenly feeling like a costume that no longer fit. Margaret's written words continued their systematic dismantling. "Victoria, you've made a career out of performing grief and joy with equal insincerity, depending on what the occasion requires. Your tears at family funerals are matched only by your laughter at family celebrations, both delivered with the same theatrical precision that suggests you've never felt a genuine emotion in your adult life. I've watched you teach your daughter that manipulation is an acceptable substitute for achievement. I've spent the last 18 months of my life with someone who reminded me why I started building this empire in the first place. Someone who understood that success isn't inherited, it's earned through dedication, integrity, and the willingness to work for something bigger than yourself. Someone who never once asked me what I might be willing to give them, but instead asked what they could learn from the experiences I'd accumulated over 70 years. Robert interrupted with a voice shaking with anger. This is completely inappropriate. We didn't come here to be lectured by a dead woman about our supposed character flaws. We came here for a legal proceeding, and I expect you to conduct it professionally. Harold adjusted his glasses and met Robert's glare with practiced calm. Mr. Whitmore, your sister was very specific about how this reading should be conducted. As her attorney, I'm legally obligated to follow her instructions exactly. If you'd prefer to leave, you're certainly free to do so, but the reading will continue with or without your participation. Charles tried a different approach, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he probably used with difficult clients. Harold, surely you can understand our position here. We're grieving. And these personal attacks are making an already difficult situation unnecessarily painful. Perhaps we could skip ahead to the actual distribution of assets. I'm afraid that's not possible, Harold replied, returning to Margaret's letter. Mrs. Whitmore was very clear that the context she provided was integral to understanding her decisions. He found his place and continued. I want to be very clear about something that seems to have been misunderstood throughout my adult life. I didn't build this empire to provide a safety net for family members who never bothered to build anything for themselves. I built it because I believed that hard work and intelligent risk-taking should be rewarded. The words hit me like a physical force. Margaret had never spoken to me directly about her family's treatment of me, but she'd clearly been paying attention to every slight, every condescending comment, every moment when they'd made me feel like an outsider. She'd been building a case against them while simultaneously building me up. The question I've been asking myself is what kind of legacy I want to leave behind. Do I want to enable another generation of people who confuse inheritance with achievement? Do I want to reward decades of contempt and condescension simply because it comes from people who share my DNA? Or do I want to invest in someone who represents the values that built this empire in the first place? Victoria's composure finally cracked, her makeup beginning to run as her eyes filled with tears. This is cruel. Margaret was family. How can she sit in judgment of us like this? How can she reduce decades of love and support to these terrible accusations? But Margaret had anticipated this response. Harold turned to a new page. I expect that some of you will claim that these assessments are unfair, that they don't reflect the complexity of family relationships. I would ask you to consider whether that love and support was offered freely or whether it was always contingent on the assumption that it would eventually be financially rewarded. The room was completely silent now except for Harold's voice and Victoria's quiet sobbing. Even Ashley had put her phone down, finally understanding that something significant was happening, something that would affect her life in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. Which brings me to the matter of my estate's distribution, Harold read, his voice carrying finality. I've decided to leave the vast majority of my assets to someone who has proven herself worthy of the responsibility that comes with significant wealth. Someone who understands that money is a tool for creating opportunities, not a cushion for avoiding challenges. The pause that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. I could feel my heart hammering as Harold's eyes found mine across the table. The family members were still leaning forward expectantly, waiting for him to announce which of them had been chosen as Margaret's primary heir. Therefore, Harold continued, his voice clear and unwavering, I leave the entirety of my business holdings, both residential properties, and 85% of my investment portfolio to Sarah Michelle Torres, who has shown me that the values I built my life upon are not dead, merely waiting for the right person to carry them forward. Then Harold looked directly at me. Sarah, You are now the sole owner of the Whitmore Hospitality Empire and the primary beneficiary of Margaret Whitmore's estate. The moment Harold spoke my name, the room erupted. Robert shot to his feet so violently his chair toppled backward, crashing against the wall. This is absolutely unacceptable. That woman is not family. She's been manipulating a lonely old woman for her own financial gain. Charles was right behind him, his face purple with indignation. This will not stand. We'll contest this will. We'll have it overturned. We'll prove that she exerted undue influence over Margaret's mental state. Victoria's tears had transformed into something far more dangerous. The cold fury of someone who just realized their life's plan had been completely dismantled. 18 months, she hissed. 18 months of playing the devoted protege, and now look what you've accomplished. You should be ashamed of yourself taking advantage of an elderly woman's loneliness. But Margaret had anticipated every single one of their reactions. Harold held up his hand for silence. Before anyone makes accusations or threats about contesting this will, you should know that Mrs. Whitmore had extensive psychological evaluations performed over the past 6 months. 3 separate mental health professionals have certified that she was of completely sound mind. She also had the foresight to document many of your interactions with her, including several recorded conversations that demonstrate the attitudes she references in her letter. The fight went out of Robert like air from a punctured balloon. Charles sank back into his chair, his legal mind calculating the odds of successfully challenging a will constructed with such meticulous care. Victoria's tears resumed, but now they carried the bitter taste of defeat. Ashley looked completely lost, as if someone had just explained that the laws of gravity had been suspended. Harold wasn't finished reading. I know this decision will be controversial, Margaret's letter continued, but I want to explain my reasoning. Over the past 18 months, I've watched someone transform herself through education, dedication, and an unshakable belief that hard work can change your circumstances. I've seen her work multiple jobs while pursuing her degree, never once complaining. I've watched her treat everyone she encounters with dignity and respect, never adjusting her behavior based on what someone might be able to do for her. I've also watched my family's reaction to this relationship, Harold continued, and I've seen how quickly their tolerance turned to resentment once they realized that someone else was benefiting from my guidance. The same people who spent decades ignoring my advice suddenly became very interested in protecting me from the influence of someone who actually listened to what I had to say. Robert made one last desperate attempt. Margaret was clearly being manipulated by a master manipulator. Look at her. She comes from nothing, works as a waitress, and suddenly she's inheriting $50 million? That's not mentorship. That's exploitation. Harold's response was devastating. Mr. Whitmore, your sister specifically anticipated that accusation. She asked me to remind you that you've spent 4 decades trying to convince her to make you the executor of her estate, despite never successfully managing a business or demonstrating any financial acumen. She also documented several instances where family members made disparaging comments about her relationship with her protege, often in language that she found both classist and offensive. The specific distributions are as follows, Harold announced with legal finality. To my brother Robert, I leave $50,000 and my mother's china set. To my nephew Charles, $50,000 and my father's law books. To Victoria, my mother's jewelry collection and $25,000. To Ashley, $10,000 and my collection of art books. The amounts were insulting in their modesty, clearly calculated to provide just enough to avoid accusations of complete disinheritance while making Margaret's opinion unmistakably clear. The remainder of the estate, Harold announced, including all business interests, both residences, the investment portfolio, and all remaining liquid assets, I leave to my protege with complete confidence that she will use these resources to build something meaningful rather than simply maintain what already exists. Robert gathered what remained of his dignity and headed for the door. This isn't over. Family means something in this country, and we won't let an outsider steal what rightfully belongs to us. Harold's response was the final nail in their legal coffin. Mr. Whitmore, your sister also anticipated that threat. She asked me to inform you that any attempt to contest this will would result in the activation of a clause that would donate your bequests to charity instead. Organizations that provide education and job training to people from low-income backgrounds. She thought you might appreciate the poetic justice. As the family filed out, their dreams of inherited wealth crumbling around them, I sat in stunned silence. Margaret Whitmore had given me more than money. She'd given me validation, recognition, and the tools to continue building the empire she'd started. She'd also given me the most valuable lesson of all, that true wealth isn't measured by what you inherit, but what you create and who you choose to lift up along the way. The words wrapped around me like armor, protecting me from the hatred radiating from Margaret's family. She'd seen everything, not just my work ethic or ambition, but my character. She'd been testing me without my knowledge, watching how I treated people when I thought no one important was paying attention. Harold handed me a sealed envelope with my name in Margaret's distinctive handwriting. She asked me to give you this after the reading. She said you'd know what to do with everything she's left you, but she wanted to make sure you had some guidance for the journey ahead. His smile was genuine now. For what it's worth, I've been managing estates for 30 years, and I've never seen someone plan their legacy with such precision and purpose. She chose well. Outside the conference room windows, Boston stretched out beneath a gray October sky, full of possibilities I was only beginning to imagine. Margaret Whitmore had spent her life proving that success belongs to those willing to work for it, and now she'd given me the resources to prove it all over again. The family that had spent decades looking down on people like us had just learned that dignity and determination will always triumph over entitlement and arrogance. And somewhere, I was certain, Margaret Whitmore was smiling at the beautiful justice of it all.